Shadows and whispers. The small town of Willowbrook prided itself on two things: its picturesque main street lined with charming shops, and its ability to know everything about everyone who lived there. So when the old Hendricks house on Maple Lane sold after sitting vacant for 3 years, it took less than a day for word to spread about the mysterious new resident. Oliver Reed first noticed her on a Tuesday morning. He was arranging a display of new releases in the front window of his bookstore, turning pages, when she walked past. Despite the warm spring day, she wore a wide-brimmed hat tilted at an angle that cast a shadow across the right side of her face. Something in her careful, deliberate movements caught his attention, the way she seemed to navigate the sidewalk like someone charting unfamiliar waters. "That's her," whispered Diane from the florist shop next door, who had slipped in through the back entrance as she often did for their morning coffee ritual. "The woman who bought the Hendricks place. Does her have a name?" Oliver asked, accepting the cup she handed him. "Nora Fleming. Apparently she's some kind of musician from the city. Piano teacher or something." Diane leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Thomas at the moving company said she has the most beautiful grand piano he's ever seen. And also," she hesitated, "a rather severe scar across half her face." Oliver frowned. "And that's relevant because—" Diane had the decency to look slightly embarrassed. "I'm just telling you what I heard. People are curious, that's all." Later that afternoon, the bell above his shop door chimed, and Oliver looked up from his inventory spreadsheet to find the subject of Diane's gossip standing in his store. Up close, he could see what the tilted hat had been concealing: a web of scarring that ran from her right temple down to her jaw, pulling slightly at the corner of her eye and mouth. But what struck him more were her eyes, deep amber with flecks of gold, alert and intelligent as they scanned his shelves. "Welcome to Turning Pages," he said, smiling. "Can I help you find something?" She seemed startled by his direct approach, as if she'd expected him to stare or look away. "Yes, actually, I'm looking for books on music theory and composition, advanced level if you have them. Music section is in the back left corner." Oliver stepped out from behind the counter. "I'm Oliver Reed, by the way, owner and resident book enthusiast." "Nora Fleming," she replied, and her voice carried a melodic quality that made perfect sense for a musician. As he led her to the music section, he noticed how she angled herself to keep the scarred side of her face away from him, a habit born of 1,000 uncomfortable encounters, he imagined. "I heard you're a pianist," he said, pulling out a few volumes he thought might interest her. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "News travels fast here." "Small town," he said with an apologetic shrug. "It's both the charm and the curse of Willowbrook. Everyone knows everyone's business within hours." "And what's the current business about me?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes watchful. Oliver considered lying but opted for honesty. "That you bought the old Hendricks house, you're from the city, and you have a beautiful piano." She seemed to relax slightly. "That's more flattering than what I usually hear." As she browsed through the books he'd selected, Oliver noticed how her fingers moved subtly as if playing invisible keys. There was a grace to her movements that contradicted her otherwise guarded demeanor. "Are you opening a studio here?" he asked. Nora shook her head. "No, not teaching anymore. I'm working on compositions." Willowbrook seemed like a good place for solitude. The way she said solitude made it sound like both a refuge and a sentence. Over the next week, Nora became a regular at the bookstore, usually coming in during quiet hours when few other customers were present. She would browse for hours, sometimes buying books, sometimes just reading in the corner armchair that Oliver now thought of as hers. Meanwhile, Willowbrook did what it did best: talk. Theories about Nora's scars ranged from the tragic to the scandalous. Some said she'd been in a car accident. Others whispered about domestic violence or even acid attacks from a jealous rival. The rumors reached a fever pitch when Mrs. Winters claimed she heard piano music coming from the Hendricks house at 3 a.m, music so haunting and beautiful, it made her weep on her porch. "You should hear how they talk," Diane told Oliver over their morning coffee. "Like she's some kind of phantom of the opera hiding away with her music and her secrets." Oliver frowned. Has anyone actually tried talking to her? Well, no, Diane admitted. She doesn't exactly invite conversation. That evening, as Oliver was closing the shop, he spotted Nora hurrying down the sidewalk, head down, as a group of teenagers stared and whispered. One boy nudged another, pointing at her face, and their laughter carried clearly through the spring air. Without thinking, Oliver stepped outside. Nora, I was hoping I'd catch you. That book on Chopin's Preludes you were looking for came in today. Would you like to see it? The relief in her eyes was evident as she changed direction and headed toward his shop, away from the prying eyes and whispers. As she passed him at the doorway, she murmured, "Thank you." And in that moment, Oliver Reed, who had lived in Willowbrook all his life and thought he knew everything worth knowing about the place, realized there was much more to discover about both this town and its newest resident than met the eye. The melody behind the mask. The first time Oliver heard Nora play was purely by accident. He had decided to take a different route home, one that passed by the old Hendricks house. He told himself it was just for a change of scenery, though the fact that the path added an extra 15 minutes to his walk suggested otherwise. As he approached the Victorian home with its freshly painted blue trim, the sound stopped him in his tracks. Even through partly open windows, the music flowing from inside was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Powerful waves of emotion translated into notes that seemed to reach inside his chest and rearrange something fundamental there. Oliver stood transfixed beneath an oak tree, listening as Nora's fingers conjured a world of beauty and pain so intertwined that they became indistinguishable from one another. The piece began gently, almost tentatively, before building into something fierce and defiant that made his skin prickle with goosebumps. When the final notes faded, he remained still, afraid that any movement might break the spell. Only when the streetlights flickered on did he realize how long he'd been standing there. The next morning, Nora arrived at the bookstore earlier than usual. Oliver was still arranging his new display when the bell chimed. "You were outside my house yesterday," she said without preamble, standing just inside the door. Oliver felt heat rise to his face. "I'm sorry. I was walking by and heard you playing. It was extraordinary." She studied him for a long moment, her amber eyes unreadable. Most people would have just kept walking. Most people don't recognize what they're hearing. He hesitated, then added, "What was that piece?" "Something I'm working on. It's not finished yet." "You compose?" Even as he asked, Oliver remembered her mentioning compositions during their first meeting. "I used to perform professionally. Now I write music for others to play." She moved further into the store, running her fingers along the spines of books as if reading their titles through touch. Being on stage means being seen. Being heard is safer. The implications of her words hung in the air between them. Oliver thought of how carefully she navigated public spaces, always conscious of angles and shadows, of the tilted hat and strategic seating choices. "I'd like to hear more," he said finally. "Of your music, I mean." Nora's hand stilled on a book. "Why?" "Because it moved me. Because I've never heard anything like it." She turned to face him fully, and for the first time she made no attempt to angle away the scarred side of her face. "Friday evening, 7 o'clock. Don't bring anyone else." Oliver nodded, understanding the significance of the invitation. Word of Nora's musical talent began to spread through Willowbrook, though few had actually heard her play. The mysterious nighttime melodies became part of local lore, with some residents taking evening walks past her house, hoping to catch a fragment of music drifting through the windows. "They're saying she used to be famous," Diane informed Oliver, 3 days later. Josephine from the library looked her up. Apparently there was a Nora Fleming who performed with major orchestras about 5 years ago, then suddenly disappeared from the music scene. No explanations, no farewell concerts, just gone. "And you think our Nora is the same person? It fits, doesn't it? The timing, the piano, the scars." Diane lowered her voice. "Josephine couldn't find any pictures recent enough to confirm it's her, though." Oliver thought about the music he'd heard, about the technical brilliance and emotional depth it conveyed. Maybe she wants privacy for a reason, he suggested. Maybe that's why she chose Willowbrook. And maybe she's getting less privacy here than she bargained for, Diane admitted. I overheard Helen Branson suggesting the town should invite her to perform at the summer festival. Can you imagine? The poor woman clearly doesn't want attention. Friday evening arrived with an unexpected spring storm. Oliver stood on Nora's porch, raindrops sliding off his umbrella as he rang the doorbell. The house looked different at night, warmer, with soft light glowing from within, transforming it from a subject of gossip into someone's home. Nora opened the door wearing a simple black dress, her hair loose around her shoulders rather than pulled back in her usual tight bun. Without the strategic styling, her scars were more visible, tracing paths across her skin like rivers on a map. You came, she said, as if she'd half expected him to change his mind. I said I would. He handed her the bottle of wine he'd brought, along with a small package wrapped in brown paper. And this. She unwrapped it carefully to reveal a vintage edition of poetry by Emily Dickinson. I dwell in possibility, she read from the cover page, her fingers tracing the words. It made me think of you, Oliver said simply. The grand piano dominated her living room, a magnificent instrument of polished ebony that gleamed in the lamplight. The rest of the room was sparsely furnished, giving the impression that the piano had arrived first and everything else had been arranged around it. Would you like some wine before I play? She asked, leading him to a small seating area. I'd love that. As they sipped their drinks, Oliver noticed the subtle shift in Nora's demeanor. Here, surrounded by her books and music, the wariness that characterized her public appearances had receded. She sat straighter, her movements more fluid and natural. Do you miss performing? He asked. Nora considered the question, swirling the wine in her glass. I miss the connection with the audience. There's a moment when you're playing and you can feel them breathing with the music, feeling what you're feeling. It's intimate in a way nothing else is. She set her glass down. But I don't miss the rest. The scrutiny, the expectations, the endless judgment. Is that why you left? Her eyes met his. Partly. After the accident, everything changed. People came to see the scarred pianist rather than to hear the music. Critics wrote about my brave return and my tragic circumstances instead of my interpretations. My appearance became the story, not my art. Oliver felt a surge of indignation on her behalf. That's absurd. Your talent is extraordinary. The world is obsessed with physical beauty, she said with a shrug that didn't quite hide the hurt beneath. Even in classical music, where it should be irrelevant. Willowbrook isn't much better, is it? With all the gossip. Small towns, big cities, people are the same everywhere. She rose and moved to the piano. Enough talk. You came to hear music. For the next hour, Oliver sat mesmerized as Nora transformed before his eyes. At the piano, she was utterly uninhibited, her body swaying with the music, her face alive with emotion. She played Chopin, Rachmaninoff, and finally, her own compositions, pieces that seemed to tell stories without words, that made him feel as though he was experiencing her memories through sound. When she finished, there was a moment of perfect silence before Oliver found his voice. Nora, that was... I don't even have the words. She turned to face him, flushed from the exertion and emotion of playing. In that moment, with her eyes bright and her expression open, Oliver couldn't understand how anyone could see her as anything but beautiful. This is who I really am, she said quietly. Not the woman who hides in the shadows. This is me. I see you, he replied, and the simple truth of those words hung between them like a promise. Crescendo of Truth Summer arrived in Willowbrook with an intensity that drove residents to seek refuge in the shade of maple trees and on the banks of the creek that wound through the eastern edge of town. Oliver extended the bookstore's hours into the evenings when the worst of the day's heat had dissipated and installed additional fans to keep customers comfortable. Nora's private concert had become a weekly tradition. Every Friday evening, Oliver would arrive at her doorstep, sometimes with wine, sometimes with books he thought she might enjoy. Their friendship had deepened into something neither of them named, but both carefully nurtured, like a delicate seedling, requiring just the right balance of attention and space. In public, Nora still maintained her protective habits, the strategic seating, the angled movements, the wide-brimmed hats. But with Oliver, her guard gradually lowered. She laughed more easily, spoke more freely, and no longer adjusted her position to hide her scars when they were alone together. The town's curiosity about her had not diminished. If anything, Oliver's regular visits to the Hendricks house had fueled new speculation. "People are talking," Diane informed him one morning as she arranged a fresh bouquet of sunflowers on his counter. "About you and Nora." Oliver continued shelving new arrivals without looking up. "People in this town talk about everything. This is different, and you know it." Diane moved to block his path, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You've never shown interest in anyone since Rachel left. Now suddenly you're spending every Friday night at Nora Fleming's house. Of course people notice. We're friends. She plays music, I listen. It's hardly scandalous. Is that all it is? Friendship?" Diane's expression softened. "Oliver, I've known you since we were kids. I can see there's something more." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It doesn't matter what it is or isn't. Nora values her privacy. The last thing she needs is to become the center of more gossip." "Fair enough," Diane conceded. "But just so you know, not all the talk is unkind. Many people are simply happy to see you happy again." That evening, as Oliver locked up the bookstore, he spotted a familiar figure across the street. Nora stood in front of the community bulletin board, reading a poster that had been put up that morning. Even from a distance, he could sense her tension in the rigid line of her shoulders. "Nora," he called, crossing to join her. She turned, her expression troubled. "Did you know about this?" The poster announced the annual Willowbrook Summer Festival, now just 3 weeks away. Prominently displayed was a new addition to the usual activities. Special piano performance by Willowbrook's own musical mystery, Nora Fleming. "No," Oliver said, anger rising in his chest. "This is the first I've seen of it." "Who would—" "Helen Branson," Nora supplied, her voice tight. "She came to my house this morning with the festival committee, said they'd heard about my extraordinary talent and how wonderful it would be for the town to experience it firsthand." "What did you tell her?" "That I don't perform publicly anymore." She acted as if it were a simple case of stage fright that I needed to overcome. Nora's laugh held no humor. She said exposure therapy is the best cure, and left before I could refuse more firmly. Oliver carefully removed the pushpins and took down the poster. "I'll talk to Helen. This isn't right." "It's fine," Nora said, though her expression suggested otherwise. "I'll handle it." They walked together in silence, the tension of the moment gradually easing as they left the town center behind. The evening air was heavy with the scent of jasmine, and freshly cut grass and fireflies had begun to appear, their gentle lights blinking in the gathering dusk. "I never told you how I got these," Nora said suddenly, gesturing to her scars as they paused by the creek bridge. Oliver waited, sensing the importance of the moment. "It was a school bus accident," she continued, leaning against the bridge railing. "I was driving behind it on a country road heading to a concert venue. The bus veered off the road and hit a utility pole. The impact ruptured the fuel tank." She closed her eyes briefly. "I pulled over and ran to help. There were children screaming inside, and the driver was unconscious." Oliver could see it in his mind's eye, Nora rushing toward danger while others might have turned away. "I managed to get the emergency door open and started helping children out. Everything happened so fast. I had gotten most of them to safety when I realized one little girl was still trapped inside, her arm caught in a twisted piece of metal." Nora's voice remained steady, but her hands gripped the railing tightly. "By then, the flames had reached the front of the bus. I knew we only had seconds. You went back in?" Oliver said softly. She nodded. "I had to free her arm first. The metal was hot, burning through my gloves. When I finally got her loose, the fire was everywhere. We barely made it out before the bus exploded. She escaped with minor burns, but I wasn't as fortunate. Her fingers traced the path of her scars. The right side of my face and neck took the worst of it. 3 surgeries later, this is the result. Oliver reached out, hesitating just before his fingers would have touched her face. Nora closed the distance, pressing her cheek against his palm. 12 children survived that day, she whispered. The papers called me a hero, but after the headlines faded and the bandages came off, the world went back to judging me by my appearance. Audiences that had once been captivated by my music now stared at my scars. Promoters suggested I consider playing behind a screen. That's why you left performing, Oliver realized. I couldn't separate myself from my music that way. Playing has always been about connection, about vulnerability. She stepped back, dropping her hands to her sides. So I chose to disappear. Instead, to become a composer rather than a performer, to live somewhere quiet where I could at least control when and how I was seen. Until Helen Branson decided to put you on display, Oliver said, understanding dawning. The irony isn't lost on me, Nora replied with a sad smile. I came to Willowbrook for anonymity, only to become more conspicuous than ever. They resumed, walking, following the path that led toward Nora's house. The fireflies seemed to accompany them, nature's own gentle symphony of light. Why did you tell me? Oliver asked as they reached her gate. About the accident, I mean. Nora looked up at him, her amber eyes reflecting the last light of day. Because you've never once looked at me with pity. Because when you listen to me, play, you hear the music, not the story behind the musician. She paused. And because I think I'm falling in love with you, Oliver Reed. And you deserve to know the whole truth about who I am. The words hung between them, as delicate and luminous as the fireflies dancing around their heads. Oliver stepped closer, carefully tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against the textured skin of her cheek. I started falling the moment I heard you play, he admitted. The music showed me who you really are long before you told me your story. When he kissed her, it was gentle at first, a question rather than a demand. Nora answered by drawing him closer, her arms encircling his neck as the kiss deepened into something that felt like coming home after a long journey. Later, as Oliver walked back to his apartment above the bookstore, he realized that for the first time since he'd known her, Nora had stood in the full light of the street lamp, making no attempt to hide her scars or angle her face away. It was a small act of courage that moved him more deeply than words could express. What neither of them noticed was Helen Branson watching from her car parked down the street, her cell phone capturing the moment their lips met, already composing, a text message that would spread through Willowbrook before morning. Dissonant voices. The text message and accompanying photo spread through Willowbrook with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. By morning, most of the town had seen the image of Oliver and Nora kissing beneath the street lamp, their silhouettes, backlit like figures in a romantic film. Oliver first realized something was amiss when he opened the bookstore and found 3 customers already waiting, unusual for a Saturday morning. They browsed casually, but watched him with barely disguised interest, whispering among themselves. When Diane burst through the back door without her customary coffee offering, her expression told him everything. You've seen it, he said, not a question. Everyone has. She pulled out her phone and showed him the image. Helen Branson. She sent it to the entire festival committee group chat, and from there, she gestured vaguely at the town beyond his windows. Oliver felt a surge, a protective anger. She had no right. No, she didn't, Diane agreed, surprising him with her vehemence. It's invasive and cruel. But Oliver, this is going to force your hand, you know that, right? You can't just pretend it's not happening. The bell above the door chimed, and both turned to see Peter Wallace, Oliver's oldest friend and Willowbrook's only doctor, entering the shop. His expression was grave as he approached the counter. Have you checked on Nora this morning? Peter asked without preamble. Not yet. Why? Someone left a note on her door. Peter's jaw tightened. I was driving past on my way to the clinic and saw her standing on her porch reading it. She looked upset. Oliver didn't wait to hear more. He flipped the open sign to closed and headed for the door. "Can you watch the shop for an hour?" he asked Diane, who nodded immediately. He found Nora in her garden, methodically pulling weeds with such force that she was uprooting flowers along with them. When she heard his footsteps, she looked up, and the resignation in her eyes made his heart ache. "I saw the picture," he said, kneeling beside her in the soil. "Everyone has." She yanked another weed, her knuckles white around the stem. "The phone started ringing at 6 this morning. I've stopped answering." Peter mentioned a note. Nora sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on her gardening apron. "It was pinned to the door when I went out for the morning paper." She reached into her pocket and handed him a folded sheet. The note was typed, unsigned. "We thought you should know that Oliver Reed has a reputation for charity cases. First the homeless man he let live in his storage room, then the troubled teenager he mentored, and now you. It's what he does. Fixes broken things. Just be careful not to mistake pity for passion." Oliver read it twice, his anger building with each word. "This is vicious nonsense, is it?" Nora's voice was carefully neutral. "You did take in Marcus when he had nowhere to go. You did mentor that boy, what was his name? Jason. But that's different. Those were acts of basic human decency, not—" He stopped, realizing the trap. "You don't actually believe this, do you? That what's between us is some kind of savior complex on my part?" Nora stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "What I believe doesn't matter. What matters is that someone in this town hates me enough to try to poison whatever happiness I've found." She took the note back, folding it precisely along its original lines. "And they're not alone, judging by my phone." "What do you mean?" 3 voicemails so far. One asking if I've considered how being seen with someone like me might affect your business. Another suggesting I was selfish to trap a well-liked local man. The third just heavy breathing, which was actually the least offensive of the bunch. Oliver reached for her hand, but she stepped back, maintaining distance between them. "Nora, please, don't let them do this." "I'm not letting them do anything. I'm simply recognizing the reality of our situation." Her expression softened slightly. "You have a life here, Oliver. A business, friends, a community that respects you. I'm an outsider with scars, both visible and invisible. They'll never accept me as someone worthy of you." "I don't need their acceptance to know what I want," he insisted. "Maybe not today. But a month from now? A year? When your bookstore starts losing customers because people don't approve of your choice?" She shook her head. "I've already watched one career I loved become unsustainable because of these scars. I won't be responsible for the same happening to you." Before Oliver could respond, the sound of a car pulling into Nora's driveway interrupted them. Helen Branson emerged from a silver sedan, her smile bright and determined as she approached. "Nora, dear, I've been trying to call you all morning." She glanced at Oliver with barely concealed satisfaction. "Oh, Oliver, you're here too. How convenient." "What do you want, Helen?" Oliver's tone made it clear this was not a social visit. "Just to confirm the details for Nora's performance at the festival," Helen replied smoothly, turning her attention to Nora. "The committee is thrilled you've agreed to play. We're thinking a 20-minute set would be perfect, right after the children's choir." "I never agreed to perform," Nora said quietly. Helen waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, I know you were hesitant, but after seeing how integrated you've become in our community," her eyes flicked meaningfully to Oliver, "we assumed you'd reconsidered. It would mean so much to everyone, especially given your touching background story." "My background story?" Nora's voice had gone dangerously soft. "The bus accident, the children you saved. Such heroism deserves recognition." Helen's smile never wavered. "A few of us did some research. You're quite the inspiration, Ms. Fleming. The town would love to honor your bravery properly." Oliver stepped forward. "That's enough, Helen. You had no right to pry into Nora's past or to spread that photo, and you certainly have no right to pressure her into performing. Pressure? Goodness no. We're offering an opportunity. Helen's eyes hardened slightly. Though I must say, Oliver, I'm surprised at your attitude. You've always supported community events. Your mother was festival chair for 15 years after all. The mention of his mother, a deliberate reminder of his family's long history in Willowbrook and the expectations that came with it, struck Oliver like a physical blow. Helen knew exactly which buttons to push. My mother would never have stooped to public shaming and manipulation, he retorted. Helen's composure cracked slightly. Public shaming? All I did was share a beautiful moment between two people who clearly care for each other. If there's any shame involved, perhaps you should ask yourself why. The implication hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. Oliver felt. Nora stiffened beside him. I think you should leave now, Nora said, her voice steady despite the tension visible in her shoulders. Of course, dear. Just let me know by Wednesday about the performance. We need to finalize the program. Helen turned to go, then paused. Oh, and Oliver? Your Aunt Catherine called me this morning. She's quite concerned about your situation. You might want to check in with her. After Helen's car disappeared down the street, silence settled between them like dust after an explosion. My situation, Oliver finally said, bitter amusement in his voice. That's a creative euphemism. This is exactly what I was afraid of, Nora replied. It's already starting. The rest of the day brought a steady stream of reactions. Oliver returned to find his bookstore unusually busy, filled with people who seemed more interested in him than in any books. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from family members and old friends, some offering support, others expressing concern that thinly veiled disapproval. By evening, clear battle lines had been drawn in Willowbrook. On one side stood those who supported Oliver and Nora's relationship, led unexpectedly by Diane, who had spent the day vocally defending them to anyone who would listen. On the other side were those who considered it inappropriate or ill-advised, with Helen Branson as their unofficial spokesperson. And caught in the middle was Peter Wallace, who arrived at Oliver's apartment above the bookstore, carrying a bottle of whiskey and an expression of profound discomfort. Catherine asked me to talk to you, Peter admitted after his second drink. As your friend and as a doctor, Oliver laughed humorlessly. Let me guess. She's worried I'm having some kind of breakdown. Dating a woman with facial scars must be a sign of mental instability. She mentioned your father's depression after your mother died. Peter swirled the amber liquid in his glass. Suggested that perhaps you're not thinking clearly. That's low, even for Catherine. I told her as much. Peter set his glass down, firmly. Look, I'm here as your friend, not her messenger. Are you happy with Nora? The question caught Oliver off guard with its simplicity. Yes, he said after a moment. When I'm with her, everything else falls away. The music she creates, the way she sees the world. It's like I've been living in black and white, and suddenly there's color. Peter nodded slowly. Then why are we even having this conversation? Because it's not that simple. You've seen what's happening. The town is divided. My family is concerned. And worst of all, Nora is pulling away because she thinks she's ruining my life. And is she ruining your life? Oliver shook his head. No, but she might ruin hers by staying here. This town can be incredibly cruel to outsiders who don't conform. Then maybe the question isn't whether you should be with Nora, Peter suggested, refilling their glasses. Maybe it's whether Willowbrook deserves either of you. The statement hung between them, radical in its implication. Oliver had never considered leaving Willowbrook. The bookstore had been his parents' dream, his inheritance, his responsibility. The town was all he'd ever known, but as he lay awake, that night, Peter's words echoed in his mind. For the first time, Oliver allowed himself to imagine a different life, one where Nora could play her music without fear of judgment, where their relationship wasn't the subject of town gossip, where both of them could simply be. The thought was terrifying. It was also strangely liberating. Just before dawn, his phone lit up with a text message from Nora. "I'll play at the festival. On my terms. We need to talk." Symphony of Acceptance. The day of the Willowbrook Summer Festival arrived with perfect, blue skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of barbecue and cotton candy across the town square. Colorful bunting stretched between lampposts, and children darted between booths selling crafts and homemade preserves. On the surface, it was identical to every festival that had come before, a celebration of small-town traditions and community bonds, but beneath the cheerful facade, tension simmered. The controversy surrounding Oliver and Nora had not died down in the 2 weeks since Helen Branson's photograph had circulated. If anything, it had intensified, with the town dividing further into factions as the festival approached. Oliver stood near the makeshift stage, watching volunteers make final adjustments to the sound system. He hadn't seen Nora in 3 days, not since their last conversation, when she'd explained her decision to perform. "If I run away now, I'll never stop." "Running?" she had told him, her voice resolute as they sat in her garden. "I came to Willowbrook looking for peace, for a place to hide. Instead, I found you, and with you the courage to stop hiding." "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," Oliver had insisted. "Not to them, no." Nora's eyes had met his, steady and clear. "But to myself? Yes. I need to know I can face their stares, their judgments, and still play my music without shame." Now, as the children's choir filed off the stage to enthusiastic applause, Oliver felt his heart racing. Helen Branson approached the microphone, her flowery dress and wide-brimmed hat embodying the quintessential festival chairperson. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," Helen announced, her voice syrupy with false enthusiasm, "a special musical interlude from our newest resident, the accomplished pianist Nora Fleming." The applause was polite but reserved as Nora walked onto the stage. Oliver caught his breath. Gone was the carefully angled posture, the strategic hairstyling that minimized her scars. Instead, Nora had pulled her hair back completely, exposing the full extent of the scarring that traced from her temple down her neck and disappeared beneath the collar of her simple blue dress. She approached the microphone first rather than the piano, and the crowd fell silent in anticipation. "Thank you for the introduction, Mrs. Branson," Nora said, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "Before I play, I'd like to say a few words." Oliver could see Helen shifting uncomfortably at the edge of the stage. This deviation from the program had not been part of her plan. "Many of you know that I came to Willowbrook seeking privacy," Nora continued. "Others know that I was once a concert pianist. Some of you have even uncovered the story of how I got these scars." She gestured to her face without hesitation. "What you may not know is why I agreed to play today." The crowd was utterly silent now, captivated. 5 years ago, I ran into a burning school bus to save children I didn't know. I made that choice in an instant, without calculating the cost. And while I've never regretted saving those lives, I have spent years regretting how I allowed the consequences to diminish my own life. Nora paused, her gaze sweeping across the audience until it found Oliver. Their eyes locked, and he saw something like peace in her expression. "When I moved to Willowbrook, I was still hiding, not just my scars, but myself. I had forgotten who I was beyond my appearance, and then I met someone who reminded me." A murmur rippled through the crowd as people turned to look at Oliver. "He heard my music when others only saw my scars. He recognized my strength when I had forgotten it myself." Nora's voice softened. "In doing so, he taught me that true beauty isn't found in perfect skin or conventional features. It's found in acts of courage, in moments of kindness, in the capacity to see beyond surfaces to the heart beneath." She moved to the piano and sat down, adjusting the microphone so it would capture her voice. "I'm not playing today because anyone pressured me, or because I need public validation. I'm playing because music has always been my truest voice, and it's time I stopped silencing it out of fear." Her fingers touched the keys, and the first notes of her composition filled the square, the same piece Oliver had heard outside her window months ago. But this time it had evolved. The tentative beginning gave way not to defiance but to something more complex, a melody that spoke of loss and discovery, of hiding and being found. As she played, Oliver watched the faces in the crowd transform. The curiosity and judgment in their eyes gradually softened into something else: recognition, empathy, and finally, appreciation. By the time Nora reached the crescendo, many were openly weeping, moved by music that reached past their preconceptions, to touch something universal. Among them was Catherine, Oliver's aunt, who stood with her handkerchief pressed to her lips, her earlier disapproval replaced by an expression of profound realization. Beside her, Helen Branson looked simultaneously uncomfortable and transfixed, unable to reconcile her schemes with the undeniable beauty of what was unfolding before her. When the final notes faded, there was a moment of complete silence, a collective, held breath, before the applause began. It started slowly, then built until it thundered across the square, people rising to their feet in a standing ovation that continued long after Nora had stood and offered a simple bow. As she left the stage, the crowd parted to create a path between her and Oliver. Without hesitation, he moved toward her, and when they met in the middle, he took her hands in his. "That was the bravest thing I've ever witnessed," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Not as brave as what comes next," she replied. And before he could ask what she meant, she kissed him, right there in the center of town with everyone watching. There was no hiding, no shame, just two people embracing their truth regardless of who might judge them for it. The weeks that followed brought changes to Willowbrook that few could have predicted. The recording of Nora's festival performance, captured by a local teenager and posted online, went viral, drawing attention from music critics and orchestras across the country. Offers for commissioned compositions flooded in, along with invitations to perform that, for the first time since her accident, Nora began to seriously consider. More surprising was the transformation within the town itself. The controversy that had divided Willowbrook gradually gave way to a different kind of conversation, one about courage, about perception versus reality, about the unexpected ways love could change a person's view of themselves and others. Helen Branson, facing substantial criticism for her role in the affair, made a public apology to both Nora and Oliver during a town council meeting. It wasn't entirely graceful, but it was sincere enough to begin the process of healing the rift she had created. Oliver's Aunt Catherine arrived at the bookstore one afternoon with a small package wrapped in tissue paper. Inside was a silver frame, containing a photograph of Oliver's mother sitting at the old piano that had once occupied their living room. "She would have loved Nora's music," Catherine said simply, "and she would have been proud of the man you've become." The most significant change, however, came on a crisp autumn evening when Oliver closed the bookstore early and walked to the creek bridge where Nora had first told him the truth about her scars. She was already waiting, wrapped in a burgundy coat, her breath visible in the cool air. "I got another offer today," she said as he approached. "A teaching position at the conservatory in the city. They want me to work with their advanced composition students." Oliver nodded, having expected something like this. The question that had been forming in his mind for weeks finally crystallized into certainty. "And what did you tell them?" "That I needed to discuss it with you first." She turned to face him fully. "Oliver, I love Willowbrook. Despite everything, it's become home in a way no place has been since before the accident. But this opportunity is perfect for you," he finished. "You should take it." Surprise flickered across her face. "You want me to leave?" "No." He took her hands, his thumbs tracing circles on her palms. "I want you to thrive. And I want to be there to see it." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "You'd come with me? What about the bookstore? Your whole life is here." "The bookstore can be sold or perhaps managed by someone else while I look for a new location in the city." Oliver smiled. "As for my life, a large part of it is standing right in front of me. The rest can be rebuilt. Are you certain?" Nora searched his face. "I don't want you to regret leaving everything you know. What I know is that I love you. What I'm certain of is that home isn't a place. It's where we find the courage to be our true selves. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering on the textured skin of her cheek. You taught me that. 6 months later, Oliver stood at the back of a small recital hall, watching as Nora introduced her students' year-end showcase. The scars on her face caught the stage lights, but no one in the audience seemed to notice or care. They were too captivated by the passion in her voice as she spoke about music's power to reveal the beauty within us all. Their apartment above the new bookstore was smaller than his old place, and city life required adjustments he was still navigating. But each night when Nora played the piano by the window overlooking the street, the music filling their home with stories only she could tell, Oliver knew they had found something most people search for all their lives: the freedom to be fully themselves, scarred and imperfect, yet beautiful in ways that mattered most. In their final days in Willowbrook, Diane had helped them pack the bookstore's inventory, her usual chatter subdued by the reality of their departure. I still can't believe you're leaving all this behind, she had said, gesturing at the town beyond the windows. We're not leaving everything behind, Oliver had replied, just the parts that don't deserve to come with us. Now, as Nora's gaze found his in the dimly lit hall and her smile bloomed with unguarded joy, Oliver understood the truth of those words more deeply than ever. They had carried with them only what mattered: the courage to be seen, the capacity to truly see others, and the certainty that love, when genuine, recognizes beauty in its many forms. The symphony of their life together was just beginning. Each, movement richer than the last, played without masks or shadows, in full view of a world that might not always understand but could never again diminish the melody they created together.